And of course, in the next steps, we start to pull research, and that's when we get to deal with demographics. This is where it comes to applying research from these fancy Java pages into the real actual world. So consider boundaries of treatment. This is something that I think is being talked about more and more, but I think still hasn't had the time in the sunlight like it should, because I think it's so important, especially in the way that ABA has grown so exponentially in some areas. And insurance is now saying, oh, you have behavioral struggles, come in here. Oh, you have autism and you're age 2, come on in. You have autism and you're age 55, come on in. We need to consider, with our successful interventions that we know are evidence-based, what makes them not evidence-based? Or rather, not evidence-based, but what makes them not have the desired effect, the effect that we programmed them for. These can be prerequisite skills, such as verbal language. If you're trying to teach, for example, PECs to a learner who doesn't have identity matching, one-to-one matching, you're probably not going to go very far. Does that mean PECs isn't an effective intervention? No, it just means that the prerequisite skill, the context in which the environment was applied, wasn't the correct context for that intervention to succeed. Cognitive differences, diagnoses, resources available, and even staff and implementer competence. This is a big to me, this is a big kind of discussion point in the conversation between isolated and synthesized functional analyses. Oftentimes, that conversation is led one way or the other based on, I'm only going to do this and I'm only going to do that, when we're not considering what is the context around the functional analysis that might make one assessment more useful than the other assessment. Or maybe we start with this one and then go to that one, etc. Resources available, especially when you're talking about schools or group home settings. It's very different than the resources available in an early intervention clinic, right? So we all know that we could describe this beautiful NCR schedule where we have 0 delays to attention, and then we build in a beautiful man, and that beautiful man starts with 0 seconds unavailable, and then we slowly fade it out to 5 minutes, and that's our terminal goal. And then we've done everything we needed to. We did it, y'all. We could never even start that without a lot of staff who are only attuned to that learner. You put that learner in a 5-to-1 ratio for a group home setting, and suddenly our NCR becomes an intermittent schedule, potentially reinforcing other behaviors that aren't a functional man. So in research, what does this actually look like? Well, if you're looking for things like prerequisite skills, and you're trying to identify different verbal language skills, oftentimes in research, you'll see a report on a VB map, an ABLES, or another various speech assessment. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to take your VB map learner who is level 1.5 and match him to a 1.4 to 1.6. But it does give you information on specifically, what is this intervention talking about? Is this an FCT intervention? I probably don't need as much information on the tacting side of the VB map as I do on the manding side of the VB map. So focus on the things that are relevant. Is there cognitive differences like IQ, for all of its issues being an actual measurable thing? These are things that you'll see in research papers that will start to point you in different directions based on what the learner who experienced the research is actually like. We want similar, not exact. We don't want vast differences. Things like age, diagnoses, you're looking at things that really are going to have a significant impact on the intervention. For example, with resources, much of my grad school was done in a hospital setting. In that hospital setting, each learner had 2 staff and 1 clinical supervisor assigned to them. And there was a BCBAD over a couple different ones. We also had 2 nursing staff on site at all time. We also had a full meal service, and we also had all of the protective equipment that money could buy. And we also had all the resources and laminated materials and cards and time we needed to run these interventions. We might develop a great intervention. but then we send that learner to a 5-to-1 ratio group home, right? And so the resources available are really significant. There's some great research coming out of that setting. Specifically, that was Kennedy Krieger Institute. But we need to be careful about just blindly applying that to our learner without looking at the context, right? Was there a functional analysis under the constant supervision of nurses who were constantly intervening and changing the environment to maintain safety? And we don't have nurses to do that. Maybe we need to consider a different approach or a different style of functional analysis in that case. Staff and implementer competence. One of my favorite lines in a research article is when it says, like, at the bottom, it says, this was done to fulfill a PhD program, right? Great. I love people publishing to get their PhD. That's how the system works. And then it says who under implementers, it said first author did every implementation session. And I'm like, well, that's a little different from my 19-year-old technician who has a background in, early daycare settings, right? So if this intervention can be run with no issues and 100% fidelity with a PhD or even master's level students, we need to consider if our staff are competent to run that as well. You see this in behavioral feeding all the time. I think just about every behavioral feeding article, the last paragraph is, so this is the great effect we had. We did all of these great things. By the way, if you don't go to these 3 hospital settings and train, you probably shouldn't do this in real life. And I'm exaggerating a little bit, but that's the vibe that you get from those things. And it's important. You should not run behavioral feeding interventions that are highly complex with medically fragile students without a ton of competence in it. But if you skipped over that last little section, that's not a good place to go, right? Because you're assuming that this intervention can absolutely one-to-one be applied to your learner, when the reality is, based on the competence, it just can't. Let's see, we talked about things like this, but we're looking at VB map scores for FCT. We're looking at what's the home situation like with the caregivers related to intervention complexity and intensity. Of course, all of these things are very individualized, and it just highlights why your first conversations with caregivers aren't, all right, thanks for coming into ABA. There are 4 functions of behavior, but one's automatic, which technically means there's more, but then also they're synthesized. No, the first conversation is, tell me the story of how you got here. Tell me a little bit about why you came through our doors, and maybe maybe we can continue to talk more about how I can be a support to you. Right? We need to identify the relevant context that this intervention is going to live. One of the reasons why I was so excited when I heard Kaylin say, unless the skill is returned to its environment where it was borrowed from, everything will fall apart. I believe it's the same way with research. We need to be aware that the intervention isn't just in Java, it's in a specific context in research. And we need to be aware if that context is so controlling of that intervention that it can't be applied somewhere else. Or more likely, it can be applied, but with modifications. And that's where that's where when we get to the second half of this presentation, we're going to talk a lot about what did the research say, and then what were the modifications that we did. So let's get into the nuts and bolts of actually pulling from research articles.